On D-Day, the entire 354th Fighter Group was mobilized to escort gliders. Once the gliders hit their marks, they proceeded on to the next phase of their mission by attacking bridges, railways, and German gun positions in northern France. Besides the fact that this group was instrumental to the success of the Normandy invasion, there were already some pretty heavy hitters in this group. Number 1, Jack T. Bradley was the commander of the 353rd Squadron within the group, and he survived the war as a triple ace, retiring in 1962 as a full colonel. There are interviews of him during the war on YouTube, along with gun camera footage that's pretty addictive to watch. Number 2, Major James H. Howard, commander of the 356th Squadron, was the only Allied fighter pilot during the entire European theater to be awarded the Medal of Honor. He single-handedly defended a formation of B-17s against 30 German fighter aircraft. And then there's Billie Harris. Unfortunately, there wouldn't be anyone out there to tell Billy's story for a long, long time. He wouldn't receive any new promotions, nor would he receive any medals for his heroics that day. He wouldn't be able to toast with his buddies that evening over a splash of scotch, nor would his story venture outside the borders of the tiny village in northern France that he gave his life to protect. It was a story that wouldn't surface for the next 62 years. There was once a woman named Peggy that worked in an airfield down the road in southwest Oklahoma. Women, when not working in the home, did a lot of odd and messy jobs that you wouldn't think of today. Riveters are usually the first answers that come to mind when you think about women's roles outside the home back then. Nurse is usually the second response you get, but a lot of them were enlisted in the military. A good 350,000 women joined the service during World War II. And sure, some of them were nurses. Some of them performed clerical work. The Western Union telegrams that families would receive about a husband or a son killed in action were usually typed at the desk of a woman. Some of them drove trucks and tugs at the base. A lot of them were aircraft mechanics, engineers, and even chemists. Much like my own grandmother, many women, military and civilian, were recruited for the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. My grandmother was assigned to construct parts for a radiation checking device. But probably the most impressive and close to my heart job in the military for a woman was that of a pilot. The majority of military aircraft that we know all too well first flew at the hands of a woman. B-17s, B-24s, P-47s, P-38s, you name it. Women were the ones that piloted these aircraft from the factory to the base. Some, believe it or not, were even flight instructors. While this wasn't Peggy Seal's calling, she did have her hands on an airplane for most of the day. She was an avionics technician, spending her days climbing in and out of the cockpit, checking and repairing instruments. Oftentimes, an entire blood-spattered panel would have to be replaced after falling victim to enemy fire. It was on the job that Peggy met Virgil Harris, Billie Harris's father. He would make it a goal to mention his son as often as he could, who was stationed as an Air Corps flying cadet in San Antonio. It didn't take long for the two of them to meet. They took to each other immediately and were soon married. They couldn't afford rings at the time, so Billy accepted Peggy's class ring from high school and wore it as his wedding band. The two of them were married and were looking forward to several weeks together before Billy had to deploy. Unfortunately, Billy was called to ship out early. Now, depending on where you were going and what fighter group they were assigned to, pilots would often fly new planes over to Europe. Entire bomb crews would fly airplanes across the Atlantic to their new squadrons. But this wasn't the case for Billy's group. For them, they were set up to sail across the Atlantic. This wasn't a normal cruise across the ocean. Now, I know what you're thinking. I know, Dan. We know they're not sitting by the pool with a margarita. We know they had small living quarters and a mess hall, and that's about it. But something that people forget is that the Atlantic wasn't a hostile-free zone back then. German submarines were often spotted on the east coast of the United States from time to time. I remember my grandfather telling me a story about his training during the war. He was training out of Florida in a PBY Catalina as a plane captain, and from time to time, their training missions would be real, actual missions, setting out along the coast on patrol for these subs. Now, the reason Billie Harris was called early to harbor was because a troop ship of pilots was just torpedoed by a submarine in the Atlantic. Since they were now short on pilots, he was called up early to take their place, and he and Peggy's honeymoon was cut short. Billy made it safely to port in Europe and was assigned to the 355th Fighter Squadron within the 354th Fighter Group. The group was formed in Hamilton Army Airfield in California in 1942. The group bounced around the West Coast for a little over a year and made their way to RAF Boxted in November of 1943. They were known as the Pioneer Mustang Group, as they were actually the first group to utilize the P-51 Mustang. Their primary assignments were that of escorts for long-range heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force. Now, after the Normandy invasion, though, their main focus became strafing ground targets. As a Mustang outfit, this was a rough job, and here's why. There's an ideal fighter aircraft out there to handle the job of the strafer, and she was affectionately known as the Jug. The P-47 Thunderbolt was, for lack of a better term, a flying tank. Besides having 850 caliber guns mounted on her, the airframe was centered around a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. 18 cylinders of muscle. This forced the engineers to make the airplane ridiculously heavy to the tune of 10,000 pounds. Now, I'm not here to get in an argument with anyone about which airplane was better, the P-51 or the P-47. I'm simply here to talk about the good and the not-so-good qualities about both airplanes. If an airman had to choose a bird for a specific job, and they were told they were being sent to strafe, they'd probably choose the Thunderbolt. Why? Well, first of all, she had great controllability in the dive. She might not have been as maneuverable as the Mustang at low altitudes as far as dogfighting goes, but that's not what we're talking about here. To strafe, the Jug did the best job. Because if you got caught at low altitude with an ME-109 on your tail, your best bet was to hunker down in your seat and wait until that annoying little German ran out of ammo. Same goes for ground targets firing back at you. The Jug could take a beating, and sometimes more than that. Egon Meyer, a well-decorated ace with the Luftwaffe, made 4 runs at a helpless, straight and level Thunderbolt. He unloaded everything he had at that big hunk of flying metal, and he ran out of ammunition. Egon had no choice but to give up and go home. As a P-51 outfit, you just have to hope that a ground target didn't fire back at you and hit you in the wrong spot while on a strafing run. That Merlin engine was liquid cooled, and if they get you in the belly-mounted radiator, it would end your day. Take a hit on a couple of cylinders in your P-47, and you'd probably keep on flying. Strafing was already a dangerous job for Billie Harris and the rest of the group, regardless of the airplane they were flying. We can all agree on that. Men would come home with telephone wires tangled around their external fuel tanks and turnips jammed inside their air scoops. Airplanes would return with bent props after literally plowing the fields during their strafing runs. That's how low they would get. When Billie Harris wasn't escorting bombers, this was his job. Billy would write home to Peggy often. He wasn't able to talk much about what he was doing, but they both did their best to stay in contact. They were pretty good at it. After all, they officially met by exchanging letters in the mail, so they had already gotten a pretty good rhythm down. D-Day in June of 1944 had come and gone, and his focus had turned from escorting to strafing. And by that time, Billy had participated in close to 100 missions and was eligible to be sent home. He had written a letter to Peggy saying that he would be home soon and that he had actually made a reservation on a troop ship to leave. But when he arrived on the docks, the injured took priority, and he was forced to wait for the next ship. Peggy received the letter with this information on July 8th, 1944. So Billy pressed on. He was eligible to go home, but he had no way of getting there. He simply had to wait. My friend Matt told me a story once about his father in Vietnam. His father was the very first to fly 100 missions in an F-105 without being shot down. He told me that he knows of many men that would be done with their tour of duty and would be waiting at the bus stop, but their bus would be late. And they'd say to themselves, "Yeah, I've got time for one more mission." So they'd hop in their 105 and boom, POW. Billy was in the same situation, although the buses didn't leave every hour. He would have to wait for another couple weeks for his spot on the ship. So up he goes for another mission. And it isn't exactly clear whether or not he was assigned to an escort that day or if he was assigned to ground targets, but Harris found himself in his P-51 directly over the village of Levant in northern France. Looking down, he spots the French resistance actively defending this small town. And inside the tree line, he spotted Germans attempting to muscle their way in. It is time, once again, to use that mighty Mustang as a strafing tool. Pass after pass, he helps the French resistance defend Levant. He has no air support and absolutely zero intelligence on the surrounding area. About the only thing he knows is that the bad guys are in the trees and very hard to see. This was an even riskier situation than strafing on a known ground target. There's no way for him to know what armament he was going up against, and he had no way of seeing how much of it was down there. He had limited ammunition on his solo airplane, and there were most certainly ground targets that had perfectly camouflaged themselves beyond the thick wooded tree line. After a couple of runs, Billy takes a fatal hit. It is not known whether he himself took the hit or if the Mustang took the fatal blow, but his bird settled and crashed in the woods just outside the village. The first men on the scene were that of the French resistance, as they all witnessed Harris's crash. The airplane did not burn, and as the resistance ran to the cockpit, they immediately noticed that he did not survive. Moments later, Germans began to approach the crash site. The men of the resistance quickly gathered Billy's handgun and his code book and retreated. Back at home, Peggy was none the wiser, and several weeks later she had received a telegram stating that Lieutenant Billie Harris had gone missing in action on July 7th, 1944. I'll refresh you on some dates real quick. It won't take long. The last communication that Peggy had with Billy was the letter that she had received stating that he was eligible to come home. That letter was dated by Billy as July 8th, 1944. The telegram stated that he went missing in action on July 7th. This gave Peggy a ray of hope. This was an obvious error, she thought, and she was right. There was no way he could have gone missing one day prior to writing the letter. This clerical error forced Peggy into a state of mind that it just wasn't a miscommunicated date. She was convinced that he was still alive. Months later, she was convinced that Billy had returned to the U.S. Maybe he was injured, possibly recovered, and maybe he had some lingering memory issues. The Supreme Headquarters in Allied France sent Peggy an official military release stating that Billy was on leave in the United States. So Peggy turned to the Red Cross for help. They assured Peggy that she shouldn't be concerned, and that he was most likely admitted to a hospital somewhere in the United States. Having not been contacted by Billy, after another 9 months, she reached out to her congressman, Ed Gossett, to request that they run a search through all the military hospitals. The D.C. office replied that it was way too expensive to run a search of that magnitude and that they were sure he'd turn up eventually. Finally, years later, in 1948, Peggy had received a government form asking her to indicate where she would like her husband's remains interred. Having received mixed messages and no firm solutions up until that point, she was still convinced that the records were mixed up and that they were not actually talking about her husband. The confusion mounted further when a friend of Billy's father from California reached out and said that they were confident that he had been spotted in a hotel elevator in California. This caused his father to quit his job in Oklahoma and set a course to find his son. And as you can probably guess, he wasn't found. Decades passed, with no clear-cut picture on what had happened to Billy. As it turns out, the original missing in action telegram was correct, minus the date. When typing the telegram, the typist neglected to put a number 1 in front of the 7, which is what caused Peggy to believe that her husband was still alive. Billy was shot down and killed in action on July 17th, 1944. Unfortunately, Peggy had to wait for the turn of the new millennia to find out exactly what had happened to her husband. Alton Harvey, cousin of Billie Harris and born well after Billy had died, always had a bad taste in his mouth about what had happened to Billy. He wanted to know the facts, once and for all. He started his research in an age when records were becoming more widely available and accessible to the public. He reached out to the Department of the Army hoping for answers. He put in his request for information and was told that he would need to be patient, as many requests were coming through, and they had a limited staff dedicated to such a role. But to Alton's surprise, he received a call back from D.C. in only a couple of days. Alton's timing couldn't have been better. He had clearly caused some heads to turn. Just 6 months earlier, a French woman had requested the same information. The information on Billie Harris had already been pulled, and it was readily available for Alton. The French woman, by the name of Valérie Quesnel, was a board member of the small town of Levant. The town was observing the 60th anniversary of the French liberation from Nazi Germany. Many were to be paid tribute at this anniversary. Those who would be honored at the ceremony included first and foremost the citizens that were killed by the air raids in 1944. In addition, those that fought with the French resistance were to be honored as well. And one more honoree was to be included. A lone pilot who was shot down over the town and crashed in the nearby woods. A pilot that was buried in the center of town of Levant. A Canadian pilot by the name of Billie Harris. The town had written an article in the local newspaper about the upcoming event. While read by many, the article caught the attention of one man who just happened to be the president of the Normandy Association. That man was Mr. Heward. His immediate statement regarding the article was that he didn't believe that the pilot was Canadian, and he was right. He reached out to Valerie and noted in his letter to her that while there is still a large marker attributed to him in the center of the village, he believes that the pilot was an American, was moved away from his burial site at the marker in 1946, and was permanently interred in Normandy American Cemetery. Valerie proceeded to that cemetery and verified the information. This is where Valerie's search for the Department of the Army had begun, and 6 months later, the two individual searches between Valerie and Alton had intertwined. Now, there's a reason why Billy was initially believed to be a Canadian and not an American. When the French resistance ran up to the crash site, as stated previously, they noted that Billy was already dead. As the Germans approached, all they had time to do was grab his code book and his sidearm. When the Germans arrived, they had left Billy's body, but they had taken his name patch. But before the French had left, one of them had noticed the name patch, and they committed the name to memory. But they misread it. The patch said Billie D. Harris. The Frenchman interpreted the patch as saying Billie de Harris, with an apostrophe between the D and the H, making them assume that he was most likely Canadian. With that misinformation, it would have never led anyone to research any other info on Billy. That other info would have been the key that had opened the lock. This information revealed that when the Germans had arrived on the crash scene, not only did they remove his name patch, but other items taken included his mother's name and address and a ring with a kitten on it, bearing the inscription PLS and Vernon High School, 1941. This was actually Peggy's high school ring. When they were married, as stated before, they couldn't afford rings. And Peggy gave Billy her high school ring during the ceremony. Both Alton and Valerie finally made contact, and Peggy was finally given some concrete information. After the dust had settled on the day of the crash, the townspeople retrieved Billy's body from his Mustang. He was wrapped in a sheet by a woman named Mrs. Frigeau and placed in an oak coffin. His body was buried just 2 days later in the company of over 70 people in the center of the village. The coffin was covered with summer flowers provided by the home gardens of the townspeople. Billy was placed in the village cemetery, surrounded by the graves of other heroes of the town that had assisted the French resistance. Ever since their country was liberated, and even after his body was removed in 1946, the town continued to pay tribute to the heroes several times per year. Billy, while being listed on his grave as unknown, continues to be part of the townspeople's tributes to this day and is referenced as the pilot that saved their town. Communication soon started between Valerie and Peggy, and Valerie wasted no time informing the mayor of their correspondence. In 2012, the mayor of Levant, Christine Fessard, immediately extended an invitation to Peggy to visit the town. Peggy graciously accepted and arrived in Paris in April with two others, Alton Harvey and his wife Gay. The group was immediately met by Valerie, who transported all three of them to Levant. During their stay, Peggy was welcomed by all. They held a special ceremony in town where a total of 300 people attended. She was even escorted to the scene of the crash, where a man named Guy Serlot tagged along. He was a young freedom fighter on July 17, 1944, and had witnessed Billy's plane crash. He mentioned that he had run up to the plane, but had noticed that he was already dead and immediately ran away as they heard the Germans coming. She was also brought to the cemetery in Normandy, where his actual remains are buried. She received permission to sprinkle soil over Billy's grave that originated from his parents' burial sites in Altus, Oklahoma. I would recommend watching a visual of this story on YouTube. It is titled The Longest Wait, and I'll leave a link in the show notes for you. I'll also leave links to articles written by AHP WordPress and Joyce Ann Ashley on the 354th Fighter Group website. All three sources did a tremendous job of uncovering this story and deserve credit for the research. During his service, Billy Dow Harris was awarded 2 Air Medals with 11 oak leaf clusters and the Distinguished Flying Cross. Peggy Harris never remarried. After her visit overseas, she commented on her experience by saying, "I don't want to say that this has been closure, because I don't like that word. I guess the best way to describe it is relief. To finally know the entire story. To be able to bring it all together. And to know what really happened."